general welcoming remark.
I'll talk about it.
Okay, I want to just thank you all for coming tonight. This was a difficult night because we had many Know Your School nights. I know, like, the Republican State Committee members had a big thing, so nobody could make it from, like, the Republican State Committee meetings. We also had a huge union delegate meeting in Worcester, which took up about 120 people. They would have loved to be here, too. So it was just a lot of conflict tonight, but we have a phenomenal presentation that we will, Peg will be presenting to you. Let me just acknowledge, we do have a couple school committee members here. We have Summer. Summer, can you just stand up, please, from Halifax? We have Dave McGeaney, Dave from Peabody. Am I missing anybody? And we have Representative Kevin Kurros from the 8th Worcester. Okay. Anybody else elected here that I'm overlooking? Selectmen? Anybody? Okay, thank you. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Dean. Dean is going to introduce Peg, and Peg is going to bring us through a very, very educational process here, and she has slideshows and everything. So this will be really good if you want to take notes. I would advise you to do that. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Peg Luksic is a Pennsylvania teacher with over 35 years of experience in both special education and elementary education. She has taught at every level from preschool to college in regular classrooms, resource centers, self-contained special ed classes, and in alternative educational settings. She has trained teachers in curriculum and classroom management, something that's always a challenge. Written and evaluated curricula, authored several books on education issues, and hosted a nationally syndicated television program dealing with education in America. She founded a program to assist low-income single moms completing their educations, which is recognized by President Reagan and named as a National Point of Light by President George Bush 41. Peg served as advisor to President Reagan's Commission on the Family and worked for the U.S. Department of Education, where her task was to review and evaluate education reform initiatives. Peg was a founding board member of the Pennsylvania Family Institute, the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. Most importantly, Peg and Jim, her husband of 35 years, have raised 6 wonderful children and now proud, very proud grandparents. Please welcome Dr. Peg Luksic.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. If I don't do this first, I'll forget, so I always do this part first. We'll be talking about these, because when I travel, people say, like, you talk too fast. It's like drinking from a fire hose. So I created a system of videos to give you information. They're available on the side for a small donation. The first, Should Our Children Be Standardized, actually talks about what happens when you try to mandate that every child achieve the same thing to the same level at the same time, and what does the research say. And this one includes the new Advanced Placement U.S. History exam course framework that goes into effect this year. This is the history course that will be taught to the best and the brightest of our 12th graders that teaches World War II without mentioning a man named Adolf Hitler. So just so you have some information on that. The second, Invalid and Unreliable, is talks about the actual testing. When I was in grad school, part of my fellowship was to actually work at the testing clinic at the university. So I administered psychometric tests and evaluated them and taught other people how to do it. And we're going to go through the tests tonight. What I'm doing for you tonight, I actually looked at your Massachusetts documents. So we're going to be looking at what you do right here in Massachusetts. The video is a little more generic. It gives you a kind of a broader picture of what's happening all across the country. But many people don't understand the testing is the key, and the tests are designed to be discriminatory. So if you want to look at the test, that's this one. The yellow one is New York. Massachusetts is a governing state in the PARCC testing consortium, as is New York, and they're ahead of you. So if you want to know where you're going, look at New York. And the final one is Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania we don't do in my state the PARCC test, they develop their own. But if you want to look at what happens when the state does its own and how it fits together, Pennsylvania gives you a kind of a blow-by-blow of how dishonest sadly, a state can be. So it actually documents some of the falsehoods that happen. So those are the 4 videos. You can pick and choose. We'll talk about them a little bit later. They're available on the side for a small donation, and afterward you can see me for that. The most important part of this presentation is going to be the screen. I'm prettier than the screen, but look at the screen. You are going to be seeing government documents. You are going to be seeing what Massachusetts sent to the federal government. Why do I use that? For the same reason that when you go to the bank for a loan, and the bank says, how much money did you make? And you say, $1,000, and the bank says, that's very nice. Can I see your IRS tax return? Because you might lie to the bank, but you probably didn't lie to the IRS. When the State Department of Education tells you they're doing X, but they tell Washington in a document that they use to get money or relief from a federal regulation that they're doing Y, they're doing Y. Because it's not a crime to lie to you, but they'll get in a lot of trouble if they lie to Washington. So we're going to be looking at your state documents and actual examples. I pulled some of the scoring rubrics from your state tests so we can talk about those to see how these pieces fit together, okay? We've already talked about me. Now, Common Core didn't come from nowhere. Actually, if you go all the way back to 1994, we can go a little earlier. If you go back to 1989, when Bush the senior was president, he held a summit meeting with the National Governors Association, who at the time was chaired by a man named William Clinton. And together, they remade education policy away from local control and began to set national education goals. In 1994, Mr. Clinton's administration passed legislation called Goals 2000 that mandated that the states write academic content standards and academic achievement standards that would be applicable to every public school child in the state. So when you hear that this is state-led, that is in fact factually incorrect. It has been federally mandated since 1994. All of the idea that the state can set content standards and achievement standards was driven by the federal government from the very beginning. Now, in the 1990s, the name for it was called outcome-based education, and it created a ruckus all over the country. I know, I was one of the leading national opponents then, too. And so the Goals 2000 legislation had no teeth. But in 2001, No Child Left Behind was passed. That was Bush the Jr. So you notice Republican, Democrat, Republican. This crosses all party lines. No Child Left Behind put teeth into the legislation. It reaffirmed that content standards had to be set and achievement standards had to be set. But it said if schools didn't meet them, there would be consequences. Now, how did the schools measure? Well, the legislation said that the schools had to set, and this is actually the language from the law, the schools had to create yearly assessments. All the states had to create yearly assessments to determine the performance of the children. That's how it would be measured, and that the assessments would be what was called valid and reliable. Now, when you talk about Common Core, they throw the words valid and reliable around a lot. All the assessments are valid and reliable, this is going to be valid and reliable. Those words mean something. They're not just fluff adjectives. When we talk about testing, those words have definite meanings. We use them in medicine, we use them in manufacturing, we use them in accounting. And they have prescribed meanings. What do they mean? Validity is how well a test measures what it says it's going to measure. So if I say that this is a multiplication test, would you expect to see a question that says spell the word cat? No, of course not, because that wouldn't be measuring multiplication. So validity says I am measuring what I say I'm going to measure and nothing else. I'm going to eliminate anything that would get in the way of getting an accurate measurement for this thing I say I'm going to measure. There's levels to that. The first is called construct validity. That means that we're going to make sure that everything that would get in the way for the subject is going to be eliminated. So the only variable in the picture will be the thing I want to measure. Medicine does that. In medicine, when they treat a new drug or a new medical device, they do everything they can to eliminate anything that would be extraneous in the volunteers that they use to test the device. So what do? This is from the United Kingdom's Clinical Research Organization. It's the largest in the United Kingdom. The first thing that happens is the volunteers come in and they say, we're going to take your medical history. You get a complete physical. What's your pulse rate, what's your blood pressure, what's your liver function. If you do not meet the parameters, they throw you out of the study. So if we're doing a study on how this drug will affect weight loss, and you only need to lose 3 pounds, they don't really want you to be part of the study because that's not going to be the same picture. They won't get the same information. So the first thing that they do in medicine is they do a complete physical, and anybody who doesn't meet the parameters gets tossed out of the study. The second thing that happens is that you have to come in, and the trial happens in the hospital environment. You have to come in anywhere from 72 hours to 7 days before they begin the test. My sister used to work for one of the big testing companies. She's a VSN, and she worked in one of the testing for one of these drug companies, and she said these people live the life of Riley, because they come in 3 to 7 days ahead of time, and basically they can do whatever they want. Well, why do they do that? So they're sure everybody had the same meals. Everybody got 8 hours of sleep. You didn't come in drunk. You hadn't been on the bed last night, and you come in with a hangover. You weren't hungry. They control everything about you before they begin the test to eliminate any extraneous factors. Well, what happens when we give a test in schools? Students come in to that picture. We don't know what they bring to the table. Maybe they're sick, but nobody knows it yet. You know that day when you're sort of coming down with the flu, but you got up in the morning and you're like, I can get through the day, and as the day went on, you felt worse and worse and worse, and the next day you stayed home. One of my younger sisters, when we were in school, the school gave exams in January and in June. And in after the January exams, the principal called my mother and said, Mrs. McKenna, I'm really not sure what happened. She flunked everything. We didn't see a problem at all. We really need to talk about this. So they scheduled an appointment for 2 days later, and in the day in the middle, my mother called and said, never mind, she broke out in the measles last night. She was, you know, when kids used to get the measles, you were sick before the rash. So she was ill, but nobody knew it. Perhaps your dog died last night. Something happened that was emotionally upsetting, and children do not compartmentalize very well. So if something happened that was very upsetting to them the night before, they're still upset the next morning. Perhaps there was upheaval in the family. You know, there was a divorce, there was a big argument, something went wrong. Perhaps there was something that happened in the neighborhood. There was a fire down the street, and 3 ambulances and 3 fire trucks, and you know what happens, every kid's looking out the window all night, because that's what children do. Perhaps they didn't have good nutrition. They didn't have breakfast that morning. In any given testing population, about 10% of the kids will have one of those factors operating in their lives that day. But nobody knows which 10% they are. So there's no way to know for which children those results were affected by something that had nothing to do with their academic achievement. However, as the socioeconomic status of the child goes down, that percentage goes up, because they are more likely to have had upheaval in their house the night before, or not have had breakfast. I was in New York, and a teacher talked about how in her first grade classroom, one of the little 6-year-olds had seen her mother shot on her front porch in a drive-by shooting. And you want her to take a test and expect that you're going to get a decent result? In any testing situation, there's no way to control for what the children bring to the table, which by definition means that the results are not valid, because you don't know if you're testing academic achievement or an extraneous factor. And it is not valid in a way that is discriminatory against children as their socioeconomic status goes down. So the children for whom we most need good results are the children for whom we are least likely to get them. Second extraneous factor, calculator use. In our math assessments, what we're finding across the country, this is from Pennsylvania, the kids can use a calculator for the Algebra 1 test. So they're given numerical problems, reduce this fraction. All they have to do is plug the numbers in the calculator, and they're going to get an answer. Well, that's Pennsylvania. Well, here's Massachusetts. And this is from your test administrator's manual for the test that was given just last year. And your kids can take a calculator as well. And I looked up what happens in your Session 2 exams, and the first sets of questions are multiple choice. So we're really not testing math, we're testing how well they use a calculator. Now the kids can bring their own, but here in Massachusetts, if the child doesn't have a 4-function calculator, the school will provide one. And that sounds like it leveled the playing field. But if you have one, you use it all the time, so you know what buttons to push and how they work. You ever been handed a new machine? There's that thing called a learning curve. My cell phone is to the point where the dear thing, if I don't keep it plugged in, the battery lasts about 3.5 minutes. And my kids are like, Mom, why aren't you getting a new cell phone? Frankly, because I don't want to go through the learning curve of learning a new cell phone. Like, I know how all this one works. I don't want to do another one. But in a testing situation, kids who don't own the calculator, we're handing you one on test day. Are you going to use it as well as somebody who has one all the time? No, you won't. You're moving into the PARCC test. In the PARCC test, they can start using a calculator in the 6th grade. Now, the PARCC has what's called a model curriculum, so that the website says, so teachers know what the children have to know at what grade, because that's how the test is going to be. So by 4th grade, they have to know how to add and subtract using a standard algorithm. You learned that in 2nd. By 6th grade, they have to know how to do long division. You learned that in 4th. But since starting in 6th grade, they can use a calculator when they take the test, you actually never need to learn to do long division at all. Now, maybe you actually do want to know how well a child uses a calculator, but you can't call it math. Remember, a valid test tests what it says it's going to test and nothing else. But when we add a calculator, it's no longer a math test. Because now we don't know if they can add or subtract or multiply or divide. All we know is, can they push the buttons on a calculator? But we're calling it math. And parents don't know that that's not what's being tested at all. What about writing ability? How could that be an extraneous factor? This is from Massachusetts. This is your math assessment. And the children are given an open response question. This one's about a manager and how many cans do you put in each row. And the kids are asked 3 sets of questions. We're going to come back to the scoring sample in a minute. At the top, the children are asked 3 separate questions. And they actually give an example. So this little one said, the answer to the first one is there are 10 cans in the 5th row. And I figured it out by doing this. And the total number of cans is 110. And at the bottom you see the math problem, where they solve the problem. And then the third question is, well, explain how you got it. And so this little one gives an explanation and drew a picture of how they got all the cans. They got 3 of the 4 points. They did all the math correctly. They did not lose a point because they couldn't do the math. They lost a point because they didn't write about it to the satisfaction of the scoring person that looked at this particular test. Now, 3 out of 4 points, that doesn't sound like such a big deal. That's 25% of your grade. If I make that a percentage, it means they got a 75 instead of 100. That sounds really different, doesn't it, when you make it that way instead of 3 out of 4. In the scoring guideline, if they didn't write about it correctly, they get a lower score, but we weren't scoring math because they did all the math correctly. We're scoring their writing ability. Well, who does that hurt? Well, first it hurts boys. Because if you ask little girls to write an essay, they'll write the front page and the back page, and they'll put little hearts over the eyes. They may even tell you what they had for breakfast that morning, because little girls like to write essays. But if you ask a boy, why did you do the math the way you did the math, he will look at you and say, because that's the way it works.